Inflation remains the big headline when it comes to the news in business and economics. As we record this, there are inflation numbers from two different places. One is the United States, which is making global headlines, 9.1%, which is a huge record. It's a record in 4 decades. 41 years to be precise, I think. And the other number that has come out is WPI, or the Wholesale Price Index inflation for India, which is 15.8%, which is slightly lower than what it was in May. This is 15.18% is for June, and it was 15.88% in May, where it was a record since September 1991 when the series started. But what we are going to talk today is not about this big inflation number. We have done that before. We are going to talk about inflation in the states. Because when we talk about inflation and we see a 4%, 5%, 6% number, that is a national number. But what we found, what economist Radhika Pandey found in her research, is that this number is not constant for the whole country. Some states have higher inflation, some states have lower inflation. Why is that? What determines this high and low inflation, and what can be done to try and ease this is what we are going to talk today. Hello and welcome to Macro Sutra. I am YP Rajesh, managing editor at ThePrint, and I have economist Radhika Pandey with me from the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. For our regular viewers, this is a slight change in format. We are doing a recorded show. We are not doing it live where we take your questions live. We've already invited questions and we will be answering those questions today. And you will see that, this is an effort to improve the quality of our programming also, because you will see graphs and graphics and all of that. It will be more interactive and more hopefully visually pleasing. So we would love your feedback on that. So Radhika, inflation in the states. When did the Statistical Office start measuring inflation in the states? Because we all thought inflation is just one number for the whole country.
So inflation in states was already measured, because when we talk about the all India level of inflation, it's coming from the states.
Mm-hmm.
It's based on the survey which is conducted across households for all states. So the number that we see as the all India CPI level index is actually a weighted average across all states. Mm-hmm. So we do have this number. It's just that it's not that publicly released. It's not that talked about that frequently, because there are lots of variations, but it's a very interesting number. And from policy perspective also, when we see that there's a lot of variation, it's something to look at. But it's very important to note that the all India CPI level number is arrived at from the state level numbers only, because we are looking at households, we are looking at the consumption patterns of households, how much they are spending across each good, and that is coming from states. So once we have the data for all states, then we aggregate and we do some weighted average and arrive at the India number.
Mm-hmm. So you have partly answered the question I was planning to ask next. So when the CPI number for June was released, that was 7% for the national number, the all India number, which was 7.04% in May, very, very marginal reduction. But Telangana was over 10%. And it was 9.45% in the previous month. So there is like a 3 percentage point difference between the national CPI and the Telangana CPI. So can you explain to us, and then you have mentioned in your piece, which the article Radhika has written for ThePrint will be in the description and notes of the show. States like Jammu Kashmir, Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim had high inflation. Andhra Pradesh also. And in contrast, there are states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Himachal Pradesh and Delhi which had a little over 5%. So there's a gap of almost 4-5 percentage points. Bihar, surprise, had the lowest inflation among all states. How does this work? Can you please explain why there is this difference?
Yeah. So there are two aspects to this. One is the weights, how the weights are assigned to the different commodity under the CPI. So if we look at CPI, if we forget about states, the all India CPI, we know that there are 5 commodity baskets within CPI. There is food and beverages, there is pan, tobacco and intoxicants, there is CPI clothing and footwear, there is fuel and light and miscellaneous. These are the 5 broad categories. And within each of these categories, weights are assigned. For example, in food and beverages, we have cereals, we have pulses and so on. Now, for each of these items within the broad commodity basket, the weights are arrived based on the consumption expenditure. Like a household in Punjab, in rural area, is asked how much of your consumption expenditure you are spending on cereals. Okay, so based on that, the weight of cereal is arrived at for rural Punjab. For example, like for all India CPI also, we have a rural number and an urban number. Similarly, for states also, we have a rural and an urban number. So the first thing to note here is that the weights are very important. The weights that are assigned to the commodity baskets and each individual item under the commodity baskets, the weights are very important, and these weights are different for different states. And within a state also, for rural and urban, the weight is different. Understandably, for example, in rural areas, the weight for food and beverages is higher as compared to in urban areas. So that is the first point to note, that for a commodity whose weight is very small, even if it's showing a very high inflation, it won't get reflected in your state CPI inflation. So the thing to note is that what are the weights that are assigned to each commodity across the commodity baskets for both rural and urban states. For example, I've given this variation. For example, in rural Assam, the weight that is assigned to food and beverages is much higher as compared to what is assigned in Kerala.
Rural Kerala.
So, rural Kerala. So, it shows, it's very interesting to see the consumption pattern of households across the states. So, whenever food and food prices will rise, it will have more impact in states where the weight of food is higher. So that is what we saw in Telangana. In Telangana, the inflation is rising because in Telangana, the weight of food and beverages, particularly for rural, is more than 52%. Whereas in Kerala, rural Kerala, the weight for food and beverages is 44%. And in urban, it is even low at 37%. So if food prices rise, it will show up as a bigger number in Telangana as compared to Kerala. So that is very important, a point to understand, that the weighing patterns across states are different and across rural and urban areas is also different.
It's very fascinating, Radhika. Like I was telling you even before we started recording this show, that the nitty-gritties of inflation at the state level.
Yes.
And like you just explained, and I'm sure most of our viewers would be finding this very, very insightful. This weight you mentioned, how is this weightage determined? Why does Telangana give higher weightage to something, and why does Kerala give less weightage to something?
So this weight is based on the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is conducted by the National Sample Survey Office. So based on these weights, the CPI weights are also determined. So households are asked how much of your consumption expenditure you are spending on food, how much you are spending within that on cereals and pulses and so on. So now, this consumer expenditure survey last was done in 2011-12. Okay, so for the period of July 2011 till June 2012. And that is why for CPI also, if you see, the base year is 2012, because it is capturing your consumption pattern for 2011-12.
That is the base.
That's the base. Yes. So that's the base. So the weights are constant. The weights are not changed. So therefore CPI, the construct of CPI is such that it is a fixed basket. So once you have that fixed basket, and now then you can compare the prices across the various commodities. Now in 2000, so this survey is supposed to be held every 5 years. Okay, so it was held in 2017-18, but it was shelved because it was just a year after demonetization, and there were problems with, there was unexplained variation, there was huge slump in consumption due to demonetization, and that survey findings were not taken on board to adjust the weights in CPI. And now we see that we are now going to do another survey, so hopefully the weights of various commodities will change now, because the consumer expenditure survey will be conducted again for rural and urban areas. So the weights are determined by the consumer expenditure survey, which is done by the National Sample Survey every 5 years.
What Radhika mentioned about Telangana versus Kerala versus Assam and all of that, we have a very nice map that has been created by our team, which will be there on the screen as we talk about it. It's a very, very insightful map. It will show you the distribution of inflation around the country, the states where it is very high, not so high, very low, low. It's fascinating. I've been fascinated by this since I read it and saw this map. So let me come to you for an example on Kerala we were talking about, because you referred to that inflation for the food and beverages category was 3.8% in June, which means it was not very high, the inflation. So why has food, we all talk about food, fuel.
Yeah.
America said food, fuel and rents. So in India, we don't take rents for inflation calculation. Food and beverages category was only 3.8. Why is food cheap in Kerala?
So one of the possible reasons for cheap food in Kerala is their efficient public distribution system. A lot of items are distributed through public distribution system. Plus, there are something called margin-free outlets. So that is the reason. And the other reason is that the prices of some of the essential commodities have not been changed in Kerala for the last 6 years.
Wow.
So that is the one of the possible reasons, though there is a need to understand each state level inflation at a disaggregated manner and to link it with the state's policies. But one of the most obvious and the reason that can explain particularly the food prices in Kerala is the public distribution system, and the same holds true for Tamil Nadu also. That they provide a lot of items under the PDS, public distribution system, and therefore, at least for the essential items, the consumers are shielded from the rise in prices. So that is why for food we are seeing there is a decline. Though if we just, see the trend over the last 4-5 months, we are talking about June, but if it's a more clearer picture will emerge if we look at, say, last 4-5 months, we see that even in Kerala, inflationary pressures are building up. So while for, if we just look at June, it's one of the states that reported low inflation, but even in Kerala, it's building up.
Okay. And the one sentence that completely stumped me, Radhika, Bihar. Bihar reported the lowest inflation among all states. Please explain that.
If we look at Bihar, and we did this analysis for all states looking at the broad components, what is striking is that in Bihar, while in other states the overall inflation is inching up, it's because understandably once the COVID cases are receding and with the reopening of the economy, we are seeing that even the aggregate state level inflation is picking up. But for Bihar, we are seeing just the opposite trend. Even the food and beverages have been declining. Most of the components are seeing a softening of prices. So it needs to be, it's very striking that Bihar's trends and most of the other states' trends are at complete contrast. So that's a very insightful picture as to what explains this variation. It's, one needs to look at the local level policies, but one thing that emerges is that in Bihar, one of the reason is that the demand has remained suppressed. So that is one reason that explains that, their demand seems to be highly elastic to prices. So when the prices go up, the consumption goes down, and therefore we are seeing a moderation. But it needs more, investigation. But the striking point is Bihar stands at complete odds with some of the general trends noticed. While there are exceptions, but the general trends noticed is that either the food and beverages component is picking up, or your miscellaneous component, which includes your services, is picking up due to resurgence of pent-up demand. But both these categories are quite moderate and reporting very low inflation numbers in Bihar.
Last big point from your piece, Radhika, that one category that has seen a surge across most of the states over the last few months is the prices of clothing and footwear.
Yes.
So, is this a demand side issue? Is it a supply side issue? What's happening to clothing and footwear?
Yeah. So again, it's very interesting. If you see across trends of commodities across various states, we are seeing that not just for the month of June, since the second half of 2021, we are seeing a huge surge in clothing and footwear. So that explains the resurgence of pent-up demand, because for 2 years we saw lockdown, particularly in some states there were very strict lockdowns and the COVID cases were very serious, and now we are seeing a resurgence of demand. We are seeing opening up of the economy, and that is what is getting reflected. And it's very, as you rightly pointed out, it's very interesting to see that clothing and footwear is picking up across a number of states. And the trend is similar, that since either from October or November of 2021, we are seeing a pickup in the prices of clothing and footwear. And that's true particularly for Haryana.
I saw that.
Their clothing and footwear is one of the highest inflation is reported in clothing and footwear. Another important point is that, in terms of contribution, the share of clothing and footwear has been increasing. So, when you aggregate your weights and inflation, you come up with contribution. That out of the 7 or 8%, what is the contribution of clothing and footwear? Across 4-5 months, we are seeing that clothing and footwear's contribution has been rising. Before that, it was constant. So it's a very striking change that is happening in the state level inflation data.
So I will make a wild guess. You can tell me I'm wrong. I think for 2 years, people were at home, working in shorts and t-shirts and pajamas and were wearing Hawaii chappals. And now they suddenly realized 2 years later, I have to go back to office. I need new clothes. I need new shoes. I need new bags. So it's reflecting. I don't know. It's a wild guess.
No, it's actually true. Anecdotally, it is true because sitting at home, you're just eating, your weight have also, body weight has also increased. So size has also changed. Size has changed. So there is a increase. And you can see that with the opening of offices, suddenly the demand for, this thing is there that, okay, now I have to buy new sets of clothes. So that's really what is happening.
Who said economics can't be fun? So we'll take some questions, Radhika. We know what your recommendation or what your conclusion is. Basically, we'll see more rate hikes. And today, as we record, we are recording this on Thursday after the American numbers came. And what was 25 or 30 basis point expectation in India is now 50 basis point expectation in the August monetary policy, which is about 3 weeks away. The first question is from Prakash Mulchandani. Hi Prakash, thanks for your question. Currently, if we see the latest Indian inflation figures, they are coming down marginally, which we also mentioned. Do you think RBI will cut the repo rate in this financial year?
No, RBI will not cut the repo rate. What it will do is it will pause on the rate hikes. So in August, there is expectation that they will raise rates, because as per their own inflation projections, inflation is likely to remain above 6% till the end of this calendar year. It will start moderating only in the next, in the Jan to March quarter. So, even by RBI's projection, inflation is expected to remain elevated. So it's unlikely that RBI will cut repo rates unless there is a some unexpected event and there's a significant revision in inflation projection. That doesn't look likely, because As you see, US has raised rates, and if India doesn't raise rates, there will be more FPI outflows.
Yeah. And look at how the rupee is falling, continues to fall. It almost touched 80 today.
80.
Next one is from Tushar. Tushar is responding to the question we asked on Twitter for this show. Why some states like Telangana, AP and Assam have higher inflation. He said, is it due to the improving standard of living of people in these states?
It could be, it's more due to the, as we talked about, resurgence of demand. Two reasons. One is transmission of input cost pressures to consumers, and the other is resurgence of demand. This is particularly true for those states where we are seeing a pickup in services prices, and that is what is reflected in our miscellaneous component. So one is clothing and footwear, that is showing an elevated level of prices, and the other is the miscellaneous items, which includes things like personal care and effects, recreation, household goods and services. So here the demand is picking up, and to some extent there has been a passing over of costs to consumers because demand is picking up. So companies can take that liberty of increasing the prices.
Guru Raj asks, does giving freebies in the name of public welfare cause problems in the long term?
Absolutely. It's a very, very insightful question, because that is what we are seeing in case of inflation data also. Those states which are reporting low inflation due to freebies, due to the fact that they are providing a lot of items under the PDS, or they are not increasing the prices of commodities in consonance with market prices, they are taking the hit. The governments are absorbing the price rises. In the long run, their fiscal position will get vulnerable. So beyond the point, they won't be able to support this cushioning of prices by taking over on them, because their fisc will be affected. So it's important that market-based measures of prices have to play a role, and that is a major reason for the difference in variation what we are seeing in the inflation levels.
Okay. Last question, Radhika. This one is from Lakshya Verma. Is inflation in states directly related to their fiscal deficit? What are the other factors that are responsible? The other factors we've discussed, but is inflation directly related to their fiscal deficit?
Yeah, so just talking a bit about the factors also. One is the public distribution system. The other is that the VAT on petrol and diesel is also different in different states. And, again, this is one data that is not readily looked at. But if you look at this data, again, you will find stark variations across states. And, Telangana is one state that has the highest value-added tax on petrol as well as diesel. And that could also explain partially the reason for increase in prices, inflation being high in Telangana. On the fiscal deficit, as we've discussed, that if the states continue to take a hit and absorb the market-determined price increases, then in the medium term, their fiscal deficits will be affected. Relatedly, you should see the Reserve Bank of India's report, where they have highlighted that there are 5 states which are highly fiscally vulnerable, and 2-3 of these states are those who have reported low inflation. So low inflation and fiscal vulnerability, to some extent, they go hand in hand.
Low inflation and fiscal vulnerability go hand in hand, but it also needs states, their political commitments and promises to balance the financial situation. And we know how it works in different states, where different parties are in power and make different promises to their constituents. But let us hope that at least in the near term, the big inflation number in India comes down, and which means it'll come down largely across the country. There will be variations. But I hope you enjoyed this particular episode of Macro Sutra. This is an insight we have all been looking for, and Radhika has been so kind to do this research for us and bring this to us. Thank you so much for watching. We will be back with another episode next week. But like I told you in the beginning of this episode, we will be advertising the question for Macro Sutra ahead of our recording. normally on Wednesday, Thursday, and then we will record it and the show will be published on Friday. So you will need to send your questions before the recording on Thursday. Please do so. We like to answer your questions and interact with us. So let's take this up again next week. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.